I'm going to start things off by introducing myself, and hopefully my compatriots up here will do the same, introduce myself. I am Erik Wieland. I am the IT director for the Department of Medicine at UCSF, which is the largest academic department at UCSF.
I'm Sullivan. I'm the director of strategic sourcing for UCSF and UC Berkeley campus.
I'm Sian Shumway, and I'm the director of customer and IT field services at UCSF. But for this presentation, I'm filling the role of my position at Berkeley, which was the manager of desktop support services, which is when all of this was done. I was fulfilling that role. I've recently moved to UCSF.
My name is Ben Gross. You'll have to excuse my bad posture. If I stand up, I'm blinded. So, or sit up, I'm blinded. I am the manager of end user infrastructure, which is a new role at UC Berkeley.
Super. So the reason our panel's here today is to talk a little bit about our experience with what I call JAX, which stands for the Joint Administrative Computing Standards Program that we share at the UCSF campus and the Berkeley campus. For those of you who don't know, JAX is exactly what it sounds like. It's a standards program for administrative laptop and desktop computers that we rolled out over the past, we designed and rolled out over the past 12 to 18 months on our campus. And what we wanted to do today is talk a little bit about the program and some of the things that we've learned in how to make a program like this start successfully on our campuses. So I've been with the campuses UCSF and UC Berkeley for about a year, and one of the first things I was asked to do was to get this program started. And when I thought about how to go about it, what I saw were goals on either campus and jointly that were relatively aligned cross-functionally. Within procurement, the idea of standards was attractive because we could leverage our spend that we have with individual suppliers and try to strengthen our buying power to improve pricing and service levels with our suppliers. And then what we saw in the IT communities was the desire, particularly in the support organizations, to have a simpler process, simpler business processes for ordering computers, simpler business processes for serving computers once they're in the field, a simpler service infrastructure that would allow us to serve our end customers, our end users out in the departments even better. And so when we looked at these complementary, the complementary objectives that people had, we saw some real opportunity. And so really, my role in procurement and strategic sourcing more than anything else was to look at the opportunity that existed on both campuses, kind of the desire of the IT organizations to move towards a standards program and find a way to facilitate it. And those are really the goals that I came into the program with.
And from the support perspective, both Sian and I were looking at this from the ability to kind of match hardware and software requirements for the first time, at least at UCSF. So we have required security software, we have required support software in a lot of different groups, and we had never really done the job of making sure that all the hardware that we know we have in the field, we could actually go back to a map of the hardware and say, we know that 2 years ago we supported this hardware, and therefore if you're going to roll out this software, you have to know whether or not it's going to be supported on the 2-year-old, 3-year-old computers. And even to the point where we were considering with OE the possibility of the new desktop support group might have different service levels for people who use or don't use the standard hardware. And it just made the whole conversation around service and support and buying, it tied it all up in a nice, neat bow. And we'd never actually thought of it that way as just an entire ecosystem that we were trying to redesign, but just the individual pieces. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of all of this. So UC has had system-wide Dell bundles for who knows how long. And one of the things that we always saw at UCSF was we liked 80% of them. But we didn't necessarily have buy-in from all the other groups on campus because they're like, oh, it doesn't meet 100% of my needs, therefore I will use 0 of them. And we wanted to figure out if there was a way to do something smaller scale at UCSF where we could actually agree among the 5 different largest desktop support groups, let's all just among ourselves agree to support the same things. And so we actually started to meet with our ITS desktop and LAN support, our School of Medicine Information Services unit, the people at SFGH, Department of Medicine, to talk about, let's just have some agreement on the 20% that we don't agree with the rest of the system on. And then we started saying, hey, think about it. This is pre-OE. We could actually start having a standard image if we could do this. And just trying to think forward about how we could actually start to see operational excellence before we even were calling it that. So this background was then brought into our operational excellence IT procurement reports. So this is actually 2011. I got that date wrong. It seems like it's been forever, but it's only been 2 years. So people like Dan Freeman and people from the procurement people before Justin was hired, we were tasked with, we need to have some standards around hardware. And we're like, great, we've been thinking about this, we've been talking about this, let's do it. And in the middle of this, we meet Sian. So Sian was working with Shell at that time. And do you want to talk a little bit about your involvement?
Sure. And so at that time, I had been sort of identified as the point person at Berkeley to participate in the UCOP-wide standards, not standards, negotiations around the actual bundles that came out that were populated on like the Dell Premier page. And I think that we were all working towards trying to leverage some sort of standardization so that we could get to better scale on support. And that was when I met Erik and started working on devising how the 2 campuses could work together in order to leverage our collective spend to sort of get a larger voice on the UCOP negotiations and standardize across campus.
So you might ask the question, why did Berkeley and San Francisco collaborate on this project, and how did that come to be? Well, like I said, my organization has the pleasure to work with both campuses, Berkeley and San Francisco. And one of the reasons that came to be is that we are very close in proximity, separated by the Bay Bridge 12 to 15 miles apart. And so there's been a kind of a long history of employees crossing the bridge and leaving a role at one institution for a role at the other. I decided to shortcut that by working for both at the same time. That just makes it harder to leave. But there's a community of people that are familiar with each other, who know each other and trust each other, and have experience working in both cultures. There was a focus within operational excellence on the idea in procurement of leveraging our spend, but also our resources. So in my team, the way that plays out is in a departmental budget for one campus, you may have enough resources to have 3 or 4 generalists who have to cover everything that happens on a college campus. And while this is an IT-focused conference, I could tell you that the money that Berkeley and San Francisco spends is very diverse. Everything from lab monkeys to riot gear to PCs. So if you have 4 generalists covering all of that, your ability to develop expertise in facilitating the needs of any one group on campus is fairly limited. But what we thought is that by pooling our resources and leveraging not just our spend, but also our business process and our resources between San Francisco and Berkeley, we could begin to invest in category expertise. So while I'm the director of strategic sourcing, that kind of makes me a generalist. But one of the things I've been able to do is invest in finding a category manager for software and recruiting a category manager for hardware who can get close to the user communities and the IT communities on both campuses and really drive procurement programs that are based on sort of the needs of the campuses rather than sort of top down just by backing into it from the spend. And then and so the campuses were thinking a lot about how they work together, and an opportunity arose and some relationships were in place where there were some vacancies in leadership And so San Francisco and Berkeley took the plunge to merge their procurement organizations together, which created some opportunities. My experience in college campuses and in our campuses, when I talk to departments, is there are a lot of ideas for collaboration, but there are very few organizations chartered to facilitating it. So for every great idea Erik has about how he could, from the School of Medicine, collaborate with someone at Berkeley, and every idea that Sian has, they have day jobs in their roles, and so really the focus part of the focus of my organization is facilitating the collaboration to turn those ideas and programs into reality.
So when we started this, we started with the question of, maybe we could just use the UCOP bundles. They're negotiated by OP. We leverage all the campus spend, but there wasn't a high sort of adoption of the OP bundles, as well as many people weren't even aware that they even existed. And the experience was always, well, that bundle can't work for me because we're too unique, we're too different, and like Erik said earlier, if it doesn't fit all of our needs all of the time, we're not really interested in using it. So our approach was sort of to stand back and say, okay, well, let's not start with the UCOP bundles. Let's figure out what will work for our campuses. And so our approach was to sort of verify how our needs differentiated from what the standard bundle that was offered. And there were unique needs at the medical center that were very different than other places. They had needs for very small form factor machines, and that was one of the early stumbling blocks. People thought that there was a lot of hardware failures, power failures because of the small form factor, and one of the ways that we got around that, and sorry if I'm jumping ahead on one of your things. I know. No, I'm still here. I'm still here. Unique needs. So one of the ways that we got around that was actually to verify the data and say that this was a legitimate need. The goal of the entire program wasn't to provide standards for the entire campus. It was to try and hit the sort of 80% of the campus users so that we could really standardize on hardware, make support easier, maybe get to the point where we were all being able to share a single image or even an image across the two campuses. That's another thing that we've looked at. And combining the spend and our standards between Berkeley and UCSF, neither one of us had very strong voices on the UCOP agreements. We participated and we spent quite a bit of time going through the RFP process, but we didn't have a big voice because we were just such a small percentage of the spend. So having our combined spend leverages our ability to influence the UCOP standards.
And one of the other things that we found was that when I looked at our Dell Premier page, I would see Department of Medicine bundles, School of Medicine bundles, psychology bundles from SFGH, from Mike over here, and just all these different bundles. And honestly, they weren't all that different. They were maybe variations on a theme. And when we started to look at why was that, we realized that it wasn't so much that the hardware itself was the problem, it was the psychology of, that can't possibly work for me because I'm special. And we wanted to find a way to restart the conversation in such a way that we weren't talking about standards so much as we were talking about needs. And that's really where we ended up was we said, what do you need and will this fill it? And when we got to the answer, 80% of it was yes. And people who had worked with us realized that they got what they wanted, and what we realized was we didn't really offer them all that much, but we just changed the way we talked about it. And so I think that if you take anything away from this initiative, it's that the talking and the having people internalize the change is almost more important than the actual change itself.
So one of the things that we had to do is actually go through the effort of determining what the bundles were going to be, getting support from the leadership on all of our campuses, and introducing and rolling out the bundles. And when you're collaborating across two campuses, that's kind of a multi-layered discussion. And in some ways, the easiest communication is with the broader community that's using the products. And the harder communication sometimes can be talking to your leadership about what you're trying to accomplish and getting their support for it. So what I tried to do from my spot in strategic sourcing was a couple of things. One was to bring together a community of folks, both from UCSF and UC Berkeley, to go through a process to look at the machines that we had access to, what our requirements were, and come to an agreement on what the content of the program is. What were the Windows standards going to be? What were the Apple standard machines going to be? And to do that, wanted to have a couple of principles. One was looking for participation from both the central IT organizations within both campuses, but also the campus IT organizations of both campuses. Two, trying to consolidate the feedback that they brought to our group and leverage it with our supplier community so that they were as best as we could have them be responsive to our needs. And then take the output of that group and synthesize it into a message that gained the executive support we needed on either campus in order to actually roll out and communicate this program. And that happened a little bit differently. At UCSF, for example, we presented the program to the Chancellor's Executive Committee at a meeting that the Chancellor herself was at, and she endorsed the program. However, and at Berkeley, the endorsement was made, and the deans of all of the colleges at Berkeley decided that they wanted to get behind the program, and they together offered a joint memo of support saying that they would like to see their schools and their campuses participate. So, my role was really to try to bring the IT organizations in both campuses to facilitate the mechanical discussion of what are the standards going to be and how are we going to communicate them, but also to manage the executive support discussion so that when we got ready to launch the program, that infrastructure was in place.
So at Berkeley, since I had been participating in the UCOP sort of PC initiatives, we didn't have a formal committee that I could go to and, that had direct representatives of desktop support organizations across campus. I represented probably support for approximately 100 different departments across campus, many of them administrative, and so I felt comfortable sort of speaking for that perspective. And what I did was sort of selectively reach out to other large IT organizations to get their buy-in on the PC initiatives, and so I leveraged that same group when we started developing the JAX standard. I was loath to open it up free fall to just everyone. I think that there was a more structured approach at UCSF with direct committees that had.
Did it seem that way? That's awesome.
It did seem that way. It seemed to have a more structured representation, whereas I sort of reached out to specific areas and worked with them individually. And then as a result of trying to come up with a standard, what we did was, we built a campus user and technology and architecture team that was not only just to provide input on the JAX standard, but also lots of different things that were coming down the pipe as part of the OE standards, like things like the BCal and is it BMail? Yeah, and BMail, the Google Calendar integrations, lots of those things. So I was able to leverage those groups, which sort of mimicked what appeared to me to be a more structured approach at UCSF. And
I had already been part of the OE IT procurement initiative at our campus, and part of that was to come up with a recommendation for not only how we should build standards, but how we should make sure that those standards continue to function. So not just the first standards, but the whole process of updating standards and all that. And one of the recommendations was to create a workstation standards group that encompassed information security people, desktop engineering people, desktop support people, procurement people, so that we could all be part of the same conversation, so that if one group recommends something, they know what the impact's going to be on the other groups. And so my first job was to just reach out to some of those people I'd already been talking to and say, hey, would you like to be part of vetting these hardware standards and coming up with the means for updating them on a regular basis? And so we started with 3 of us, and so we had, you would think that was really easy to have just a conversation. Oh, sure, 3 people can agree. I picked some of the most difficult people on campus on purpose because I wanted them to challenge the assumptions we were making. And so we did weeks worth of analysis and discussion just getting to the point where we can agree on the framework. But because of that, we got just absolute dogged support from some of these really difficult people. So I think that was a very important part of the piece of the puzzle. Want me to start?
Yeah, I already talked about some of it.
So when we came together within our own campuses to really start to figure out what is it that we're going to recommend, how are we going to make sure that this is something that's sustainable, the first thing we had to agree on were what was the principles behind how we select a piece of hardware or a bundle of hardware. And as Sian alluded to earlier, one of the things that comes up is, well, yes, I want a Dell Optiplex 990, but I need the tower. No, I need the small form factor. Dell treats those as two entirely different bundles, and you don't get the scale of savings unless you use one. And so we had to come up with principles such as it has to be, the selection has to be based on the supportability of the hardware in terms of the software that we want to use. And it has to be based on real metrics for, we can't select a small form factor because there's a higher failure rate. Well, we actually did the analysis, and we found that it was a very tiny bit more likely to have a power supply failure or memory failure or something like that. But the statistical significance wasn't there, and so we could prove that, in fact, you can use a small form factor and you actually gain 5 more support groups by using that, and that just makes our spend that much better. And so we actually went through the process of, let's build up our principles and then compare them to the system-wide bundles, and where's the gap? And actually come up with meaningful technology-based reasons for using one or the other. And then propose some things and just put it out there for comment. So, you want to pick up?
Prior to the JAX standard being actually implemented on campus, there were sort of varying levels of participation and interest in even defining what the earlier bundles were, until it became sort of a quote-unquote standard that may or may not be mandated. I think that stirred up a lot of attention and sort of focus on what we were actually doing. And that was good, because it got people engaged, and it let us see, open those conversations so we could be sure to address the things that they wanted us to address and make sure that we were catching those hardware things, and also have an opportunity to bring them into the fold and say, we can accommodate your needs within this specific program. And again, it was communicating out, we're not trying to force anyone to use everything. It's trying to hit, that 80-20 rule. And the one thing that I don't think that we did, and we couldn't get a lot of support for, was this exception process, because technically there wasn't enforcement of the hardware standards, but there was a lot of anxiety around it, which was bad in some ways because it made people, anxious, but in other ways it was good because it got them to pay attention to what we were doing and sort of look and see, oh yeah, maybe this does work, it's not a big deal, and if I really can't use it, it wasn't a laborious process that had lots of overhead that they would have to go around the standards to do.
And part of when we pitched the idea of the standards, the first question, and often the only question that was asked, was, those look good, but how do I get exempted from having to use them? Without even discussing, does this work for me, does it not work for me? And we actually decided that we wanted to make this an opt-in process anyway, so why would you need an exception process from an opt-in program? We were still asked to create one. So Justin wrote something up and we posted it, and no one asked about it ever again, but it never even became an issue. But that whole issue of making it an opt-in program came out of, at UCSF, we had a request for comment during our OEIT procurement initiative. Here's a proposal of how we might do workstation standards. What do you think? And we made the big mistake of sending it to the entire campus. And I got personal insults from researchers, because the first thing they asked me was, how dare you question the way I do my work? Who are you to question my research and everything? If we had just sent this is actually why it's called the Joint Administrative Computing Standards. Researchers wouldn't buy it, and if we insisted that they do it, they wouldn't even. The funny thing is that researchers buy them. We know that they do, but that's only because they want to. So be careful what you call things.
Yeah. I think the focus on sort of a consensus program was really important in this case. I think in higher education, in purchasing anyway, we sometimes spend a little bit too much time thinking about what we can't accomplish, right? The lack of a mandate. And what that can lead to is devoting a lot of energy to sort of the last mile that you're not going to get. And if our goal were to have our standards program cover 100% of the machines we buy, we would not be successful. But if our goal is to maximize the machines that are covered by the standard and really get close to what drives the needs of our campuses and growing and focus on growing that number and improving the value that our users who use those standards get, the benefit that will accrue to the institutions will be a lot greater than if our goal was to have a single standard that everyone was subject to and that required a lot of exceptions to be managed and things like that. So I think the focus on value versus enforcement is really a key thing that I hope our team takes away.
Brian, you have a question?
You know, I just would like to comment on what you're saying to support it, because on the ground, my experience since we brought Bear Buy on and how the purchasing system has evolved, it's actually worked really well and even better than really well. And the flexibility of the exception portion of the program is really, really simple, and it works every time. I have a large research component in my department. I have a lot of clinical researchers, and they tell me what they want. I'm able to get it for them. The differentiation in price is really minimal when it comes right down to it, and they are extremely happy and buy into the program. So I think just to say what you have done and where you're going is really, really good and has created something that's really meaningful for the larger picture of where the thing can go.
Thank you. So for those in the back and for the videotape, Brian was saying that we're perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess you know, as perfect as the program is, it can always be more perfect. And so, you know, we've launched and we've lived to, sit on stage and tell the tale. But we
haven't left the room yet.
Are we going to get off the stage? That's the question. But there are opportunities for us to both grow, opportunities for us to grow the program to make it even more valuable, and challenges to operating the current program. First of all, the flexibility of the standards and the information that we get from our vendors makes it a little bit difficult to measure the effectiveness of the program. We're getting close, but Dell, for example, has a very difficult time isolating on specific characteristics of machines and changes that you make to them. And so, getting to a number around what you think people are, the participation rate is pretty good. It feels pretty high. It feels like they become real, default choices for a lot of folks on our campus. But we're trying to still get to that program management. Our relationship with Apple in terms of how they enable commerce with us continues to be a challenge. If anyone here orders Apple machines on the UCSF campus, they know that it is not easy or fun, it is a very frustrating process. Apple's going through some enterprise IT upgrades, and on the back end of that, they've promised that they'll work with us to improve that process. They've been promising that for over 12 months, and we continue to struggle to make that an easy and effortless process for folks. But more importantly, with Apple, as you know, if you support Apple machines too, we find out when a new Apple machine is going to be released almost on the day it's released, shortly before. And immediately, the machine we were buying the next day and had a program of standards around is no longer sold. So we're often put in a very reactive position with Apple. Whereas on the Windows side, sometimes we have to kind of push ourselves to to get the standards sort of evaluated and pushed and released to campus. So a little bit of challenges with all the vendors, but different, when you think about Apple versus Dell and the Windows vendors. And then communication. I talked a little bit before about reaching end users on campus is not impossible, but it requires structure. So we use the list that we have set up for Bear Buy, but we also have to pay attention to our listservs and IT communities, both from the perspective of listening to the comments that we receive back, but also making sure we communicate information to them, because there's not a single channel where you're guaranteed to hit your entire audiences. And then the last piece is, now that the standards are in place and we're up and running, is really focusing on how we get more value out of that supplier relationship, whether that's in terms of realizing improved pricing or ability to do bulk buying, or if we can realize better service, through taking advantage of things they might offer us, like standard imaging, consignment inventories, or things like that. There's opportunities now to push our vendors in a more specific and concise way that's really backed by the campus committing to the standards and us being able to demonstrate, look, we're concentrating the volume of what we buy in these products, and here's how we work together to create more value in our supplier relationship in doing that.
So I thought to follow that up, give a bit more specifics. I'm really new to the Berkeley campus. I've been here around 2 months. And so what I'd like to talk about, well, first let me say what I think is interesting being new to JAX is that it really seems like it's offering the path of least resistance. I'm a big fan of this 80%. So what JAX, from my perspective, allows is, with Bear Buy, it's the easiest, generally the cheapest selection with a reasonable set of options, which seems to me, from checking around on campus being new, that's gone over very well. And so following up on what Justin said about additional value, one of the things we're starting to do, so the vast majority of orders are for Windows machines, and so now we're looking at the Dell Image Direct solution for factory imaging. This will have the advantage of administrative user orders a package, or it could be a researcher, and from the factory we're working on creating an image that for 80% of the campus should be pretty good. And we're not saying that's all you get, we're just saying it's simply a base you can layer on. Because I wouldn't presume to say we'll ever reasonably cover that 100%, but for the most part with a Windows image, the first 80%, very little is different across campus, even if you have widely varying uses on the machine. So Dell offers a product called Image Direct. The old way we used to do it is we'd create an image on campus, we'd upload this ginormous image via FTP to Dell, and then when you ordered the machines, they would ship it back. Dell has recently revved that program a few times, and now it's much more flexible. There's a web interface, you upload it. It's very similar to the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit or Wake. You have a base OS, and then they have this web-based workflow where you can layer images on top of that. So our current state is we have an image with Windows 7 Enterprise, we have the Productivity Suite, we have Microsoft Office 2011, Project, Visio, Adobe CS6, and that will all come on the base image. It's been promoted to factory, so now we can order machines with this image from Dell. The problem is right now is currently each of these images has a base ID. We have to call our representative, and this is something we're working on when you order the image, and then that will come from the factory. What we want to do is work toward, which I'll talk a little bit more, work towards a model where we have a selection on the website, hopefully integrated with Bear Buy. So currently, we actually have 2 images, one with CS5.5 and one with CS6, but the demand for 5.5 has dropped, so we'll probably just offer CS6. We have about 100 gigs of storage on the Dell site. The Image Direct can do a couple of nice things, sort of post-install. It can join the machines to the Active Directory domain. We do have to currently pre-create objects the way our AD is set up in order to have it, but that's another problem we'll solve. The cost is relatively cheap compared to having people do it. It's about $18 to $25 per machine. It takes us about a half a day to set up the image. It takes Dell about 3 to 5 days to audit the image, promote it to factory, and assign it ID. We did some sample ordering, and it doesn't appear to add any time to the ordering process. We ordered a machine on 4/9, it shipped on 4/18, and it arrived on 4/20, so a total of 7 business days. The big advantage is we don't have to re-image the machine. Often, one of the problems, I believe, early on with the Jacks was that it was, if you ordered the least expensive model, you got Windows 7.
Windows 7 Home.
Home, which nobody really should ever use. And so this has the advantages. From the factory, you should have something that's pretty reasonable. Also, a big advantage is Dell is responsible for the drivers. They audit the image, they check to see if all the drivers for that specific piece of hardware are there, and it's effectively their responsibility, which is pretty awesome. And the workflow, the web-based workflow really does help to streamline the image deployment. There are some unknowns. We have a request in to see how long it will take them to integrate with the bear-by punch-out system. I think this will be one of the next major advantages is if you can order the machine with the image via the punch-out, and we don't know if you can do next-day ordering with the image, direct image. This is all things we're trying to figure out. And where we want to go is, like I said, we really want this image that is viable for 80% of the community. But then on top of that, there is an option to have, say, departmental-based or other project-based deltas, where you could have this parent image, and then you could say, well, I also want the image that has, say, Microsoft Visual Studio for a developer. And that would give us quite a bit of flexibility and make it easier, even easier on the end user. And this is really useful, particularly for departments that have limited IT support, independent users, but it should be a fairly large benefit to other departments on campus that even have their own IT support, because again, that top 80% is really not that interesting to create and recreate, and you can do all the interesting work on top of that without having to build the images yourself.
So I'm going to jump in here. So those of you from UCSF who are listening to Ben talk about how this image will have all this great software, that brings up the issue of UCSF doesn't get that. We still get the machines with Windows 7 Home because we make the assumption that you're buying Mecca or Select or something. Another example of where we don't have we have something that doesn't benefit both campuses is UCSF is really pushing wireless as a way of relieving pressure on our wired network, and that means that our Dells need to have wireless, which adds currently $70 to the cost and doesn't benefit Berkeley at all. So we decided not to include that in our JAX standards, and we're trying to figure out how to make that work at UCSF rather than put it into the standard and force that conflict with our partner campus. So we have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to race through the last of these, and then we'll have questions. So the lessons learned, we thought this program was going to be really controversial, and it wasn't. And we were shocked.
It was for like half a day.
Yeah.
All the screams came in and then just sort of died.
Yeah. We also started to figure out who's using the bundles. We were talking about, we're not going to use the UC standard bundles. I didn't know we had UC standard bundles. Well, guess what? You're going to have one now. Isn't that great? Yeah, you'll save me money. We also started to figure out when people were asking us, well, you're going to get Windows 7 Home Premium. I have to use that. No, you use Mecca, right? No, what's Mecca? We started to tease out all these things that we didn't really even realize were issues. And it ended up creating a conversation that didn't exist before, which was, I think, a net benefit for the whole campus, and at least for UCSF. And the other thing we figured out was we had a lot of people who said that they were very, very price conscious. They wanted a Vostro option. They wanted an HP desktop option. And when we showed them the price difference for what they were getting, they still pled poor, but we told them, how many machines do you buy over a year? We'll run the numbers for you. And they were going to save $50 by going with a different standard, but then they would have to have their own procurement system, essentially. And they finally decided, oh, okay, fine, I'll try it your way. But I have the option to opt out, right? So.
Yeah, and I think, like Erik said, it wasn't quite as controversial as we thought. And that opened an opportunity for collaboration across the campus. People that hadn't really cared what the hardware was, weren't interested in what the Dell bundles were, now were willing to come to a meeting and participate. And when we actually, I collected everyone's feedback. We did a little affinity exercise with dots. It turned out that there were like 4 things, 4 really simple things that we were able to fix in the first iteration of the revision on the JAC standard. So it was actually really a powerful way of showing that we can implement standards, we can work together, and we're responsive. We're willing to adapt and change each time to whatever the campus needs are. And I think that that has been a very valuable lesson.